Okay, so Micha, we've been working together for a very long time, but the first thing I've really got to ask is, have I ever pronounced your name right?
You're getting closer, but I don't even know how to pronounce it myself, you know. My name is, my mom took it from the Bible, I think. It's a chapter in there.
Right.
In Hebrew, you say Micha, but yeah, my mom calls me Misha, which is more like a Russian sort of name pronunciation. But it's good enough, man. Don't worry.
Yeah, and we first met when we both had an interest in the BJJ brand Fuji, but there was a whole bunch of stuff that went on long before we ever got there. And when we first met, we spent quite some time talking about the parallels that we'd had in the business. You'd started BJJ Fight Gear. I was at that time on my way out of Fight Store Pro, although, you know, as fate would have it, I came back into it. But tell me a little bit about how you got started in the whole fight game business. Where did it all begin?
Yeah. So we indeed had a lot of parallels. We both had a multi-brand store with fight brands. I've been training martial arts since a little kid. Started with judo, karate, those type of things. Later kickboxing. I lived in China for a few years to practice kung fu there. When I came back from there, one of my buddies was pretty much into Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and he was a businessman already at an IT company. And we were always brainstorming at his office about how cool it would be to have an online store, because basically what we would then have to do is set up the store and find somebody to pack the packages, and we could just rake in the money and didn't have to work anymore. And we thought that was a great way of getting some passive income. It turned out to be a bit more work than we expected. And we looked at different qualifiers of the product category that we were going to get into. So we looked at like tea and gifts, kitchen knives, all types of products. But jiu-jitsu and martial arts, combat sports seemed like a good fit, because you have a sort of a basket size between like 50 or 100 pounds, euros, dollars, something like that. It's a growing sport. We did see a lot of perspective in that. And it's also a sort of a lifestyle sport, so you can upsell streetwear, accessories, and you can also target people really well because of people are connected to you in a sort of community way. So that all made a lot of sense to us, and we also thought, having so much passion for the sport, we could be motivated to keep pushing that on for a bit longer.
Was there any particular qualification or background that you had outside of the actual sport itself that made you feel that you would be successful in it?
The fight sports in particular, or
no, at the end of the day, both of our companies were e-commerce companies which based themselves into a niche within a niche, which is the combat sports business. And you could argue that Fight Store Pro sold BJJ gear, but it wasn't its only sport within the business. But you really went niche within the niche within the niche.
Yeah.
But outside of the actual sport, as you know, like I spent a long time in digital marketing and also worked with Fighters Only magazine and had a good handle on advertising and marketing, which lent itself to what we did with Fight Store Pro. How about you? Was there any professional qualifications or things that you'd done prior to BJJ Fight Gear that made you think, hey, this is for me?
Well, I come from a pretty entrepreneurial family. My great-grandfather had a company, a bread baking factory. And it's all like generations that kind of started from scratch. So my great-grandfather was murdered, and his family lived in poverty. So my grandfather had to build a company for himself. He's quite successful. He had a ink production company. And then he also died pretty early. I was raised by my mother, who worked on the market, street market, selling stuff. They're very small business, but I would say she was very successful in well, creating a nice life for us. We weren't rich or anything, but we went on holidays and we had a good life. And I also started my business from scratch. But I guess maybe I just didn't see the alternative growing up of working for a boss and having an actual job. So that was all I knew. But I think it's also a bit in my DNA to have my own business, run my own business.
So the entrepreneurial spirit was there without necessarily a technical qualification, or?
Definitely, yeah. I've very little experience beforehand in online marketing, e-commerce.
So when you first set up BJJ Fight Gear, and when I first set up Fight Store Pro, so there's a big difference straight away. When I set up Fight Store Pro, I immediately had a very good handle on what it took to run an e-commerce store, albeit I would say, even though I knew a lot about the marketing and the digital side of things, what I didn't understand was supply chains, profit margins, all that stuff that actually makes a business run. And I would say I learned more about marketing in the first 3 years of running Fight Store Pro than I'd done in the 10 previously working in digital marketing, because it's very different being the customer for marketing than it is being the marketeer. I mean, tell me a bit about your experiences very, very early, like your very first movements into the game. Which brands did you bring in? What was your focus at first with the store? And how did that progress?
Yeah. I 100% agree with you. You just have to get going, and it takes a lot of experience to really figure out what works in general, but especially what works for your business specifically and your industry. And I think in that sense, it helps a lot if you talk to people who have gone that way before you. It can cut a lot of time. Obviously, you still have to figure things out for yourself, but having a sort of a mentor or a friend or somebody that has gone through it, that will save you a lot of time, because they've gone through the same mistakes, and you don't have to learn it the hard way then. But about how we started, so we started with a bunch of brands that we had some relatively easy access to. So brands that were available here in Europe: Tatami Fightwear, Venom, Hayabusa. There was a Hyperfly Do or Die distributor here that we worked with. And so that was easier for us to not have to invest in huge shipments from the factory directly, or we could get started a bit smaller. And the marketing, we figured it out on the way. We tried different things. We went to tournaments with a booth. We went on different marketplaces as a third-party seller. Facebook still had some organic reach back then, which was very good. So we invested a lot in.
Just for anyone watching this, me and Micha get asked probably on at least a 2 to 3 times a week basis from various people, how do I market this? How do I do that? How do I do e-commerce? And what Micha's referring to here is the fact that Mark Zuckerberg isn't doing anybody any favors anymore.
No, no. It's time for him to reap his harvest. Yeah, exactly. But in those days, I think what we did well, we did a lot of things wrong, obviously. But one balloon that went up successfully was that we invested some money on getting Facebook followers. So you could do ads just to get followers, people to like your page.
We did the same, but
exactly.
Do you think that's cost effective anymore?
Not at all. No.
Yeah,
but then, because there was organic reach, like as soon as we had people following us, then
you could market directly to them.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
What we had a break early on, because we started in 2009 with what was then Fight Store MMA, which turned into Fight Store Pro in 13-14, I think. But we had a big break with the fact that Google shopping was free.
Yeah.
All your listings were free, and we made our first money in late 2009 on the Christmas run. I remember sitting in our tiny little office, literally watching orders come in. We were like, whoa, what is this? And I can't remember the data, but I would imagine that 95% of our orders at that time all came from Google Shopping. I mean, did you have a similar experience with Facebook early on?
Yeah, especially going into different, because we are focusing on different countries in Europe, and when we were going into a new market, then that helped us a lot. Just do it through Facebook, get a new audience.
So let's move fast forward. Let's those were the early years, and we had very similar experiences, which we talked about when we first met in person. And our mutual connection was Fuji Sports,
Right.
from which are a subsidiary or a brand name attached to Hatashita. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, exactly.
Who've been around since about the 50s, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's already a second generation business.
yeah. And Fuji, so anybody who's watching this and doesn't know, Fight Store Pro was the UK distributor for Fuji. It wasn't the first UK distributor, but probably the first successful one. And then later on, they changed their plans, and we're having limited success with it because we just simply didn't. We were distributing 2 or 3 brands at that time, and they moved to a European model, which is where you came in, right? So tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, I think we recognized early on that, at least at that stage, like these days, we're obviously moving more into a model where the middleman gets taken out, not in some mean scam way, but more that Amazon is obviously a huge player that allows it for brands to sell on there directly, and because of technology, the brands can sell directly to the consumer. But I mean, I think we're talking about 2013, 14 when we started. We recognized early on that getting exclusivity for brands was a way for us to grow our business and to make some steps in there easily and fast. So Fuji was a brand that we recognized had a lot of potential in this market, already established in different parts of Europe to a certain extent. An American brand, so we don't have to compete with the brand directly on our continent, and also a good fit with our company in terms of the branding and the values. So we it was a bit back and forth. We got approached by Fuji, and my business partner went to New York to talk to them and share some ideas, and then we set up an exclusivity arrangement for Fuji in Europe.
Yeah, and originally I think there was a discussion where they were wanting us to stay on with Fuji in the UK, but you to do the rest of mainland Europe. And eventually we just said, no, it's probably better to move it all across. But it was never any, like, a lot of people watching this would imagine that this would cause some kind of rift or a divide, but actually, in a lot of ways, it actually brought our 2 companies together early on, didn't it? There was certainly no animosity about it. It just seemed like a logical progression, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the strength also of our multi-brand stores. Like, obviously, we want to have a long-term strategic partnership with these brands, but I mean, some brands come and go, and but
all the brands seem to come and go.
Yeah, at some point. But yeah, the structure underneath there stays, and that's what one thing that we had a lot in common. So that was really nice when we met in person, also to see all those similarities.
One of the things that I've really liked about the fight sports industry over the years is what a small world it actually is. And I mean, I can't speak for a lot of other industries, but I know that in our small world, like, you're very rarely more than a couple of phone calls away from just about anybody in the business. And that open door policy allows a lot of travel, a lot of meeting people. I've been accepted in many, many countries immediately as a friend, and been, had the experience of traveling to many destinations, many countries, and seeing it much less as a tourist and much more as a, what would you call it, like an inner circle person, as a native. I've had those experiences across the world. I mean, have you had a lot of that too? Is that something that you enjoy about the business, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure if if it would have been the same if I sold cutlery or
Yeah,
mobile phones or something. I
yeah.
think it's also inherently connected to the fight gear, well, to the fight sports, to the martial arts.
It may be this. I've often wondered if it's the same in other sports
Right, right, right.
or some of the other more creative industries. But
For
I
sure.
certainly think that the combat sports business, the martial arts business, because combat sports do bring people together, then there's that structure already ingrained, which maybe isn't, say, there in music.
Yeah.
You know, like if you're in a band, like you don't instantly go out and meet other bands.
No,
It's
no,
just
no.
not, you know, it's just not, you will rub shoulders with them in the dressing room perhaps, but that's about it.
Yeah, you don't go immediately jamming together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there may well be that in other kind of artistic and creative industries where the people do meet, but it's a much more formal process and there's a lot less direct integration. Whereas I think as an industry, we are used to being lumped all in the, you know, having 10 teams in the back room having their rules talk before a fight event, or you know, everybody's milling around together at the stadium, or you
Yeah.
go to the trade shows and everybody's there and so on. So it's a very, or if you go to a tournament, obviously there's literally hundreds of competitors, teams, and everybody meets one another. So it is that type of industry, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, somehow punching each other in the face is a very bonding experience.
Yes, of course. Or breaking each other's arms and choking each
Yeah.
other unconscious, for sure. So obviously I work very, very closely with Rev Gear Sports in the US also. And Rev Gear and Fuji also work together in the US, which is even more, what's the word, incestuous. We see this with certain brands, and we've just mentioned the brands that come and go over the years. We've both been in this industry for approximately 10 years plus, there or thereabouts. And we've seen some, you know, what should have been giants disappear. Like, I mean, Tap Out being a great example. But also Hayabusa are almost unheard of now. You hardly see from them. They're still going, but it seems they're much diminished, and certainly in Europe disappeared. Bad Boy are all but gone.
Yeah.
They certainly are in Britain and America, as far as I can see. I mean, what experiences have you had in the BJJ market of brands where you thought, wow, they're going to be huge, it's driving forward, and then, you know, the next morning they seem to be gone?
I won't say, I don't know if there are a lot of examples like that, but Grips is definitely a brand that was heading in a very good direction, and then I'm not saying they're gone, but I don't know.
Seem to disappear.
Yeah, they missed a few steps, let's say. Yeah. I think it's just a matter of taking your eye off the ball and thinking you're already there or something, and you can do other stuff.
I mean, we saw it with Hayabusa was a very interesting example, because when the UFC, like, you came into the industry, right, when the UFC switched their model to Reebok, it was around that time, right?
Right, yeah.
It was like 13, 14 when they did that.
I think so, yeah.
I believe it was 2014 when it actually happened, but it was a done deal in 13. I think that was and at the time, we've been in the business since late 2009. And we were thinking Hayabusa's just going to rule the roost after this. We just thought Hayabusa are going to go for the stars. And Venom were a brand which they started in 2008 as a brand. They obviously came from France, which not a lot of people know that. Yeah. It's like a lot of people don't realize that Venom are actually French. And originally there was 3 of them, I believe. One of the guys was Brazilian. I think the designer was Brazilian. I could have this wrong, so if anyone's watching and wants to correct me, please do. But everybody at the time would have banked their savings. If they were going to do a red-black bet, everybody would have banked on Hayabusa at the time, and yet they just fell off the map. I mean, and Venom went from strength to strength. They obviously diversified their business. We saw a lot of that at that time. I mean, what was your experience coming into the industry as there was a lot of upheaval?
Well, we were trying to make some way for ourselves.
You think you kind of missed it?
Missed that transition?
Yeah. Well, because you were getting set up at the time, do you think you kind of missed the fallout of it?
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure I've spoken to brands where I had no idea how big or small they were.
Right.
We were just,
yeah.
You know.
Because we had that experience early on where we literally managed to pick the 3 brands. The stock was relatively low at the time, and then they went woof, which gave us a really good start to Fight Store. It did, and we literally don't have any of those 3 brands anymore. 10 years later, 12 years later, they're all 2 out of the 3 are definitely still going. The other one, I'm not so sure. But
I guess it's normal, right? Like most startups, what is it? The first 5 years, 80% of them is gone, or I don't know the numbers exactly, but so I guess it's the same in our industry. And it's also an industry where a lot of people get in it because they have a passion for the sports. So they want to have their own fight brand or a company, and it's relatively low barrier. Like you
get straight into the sport. It's very easy to connect with fighters and teams, and everybody wants a piece of it, and so on and so forth. And that brings us neatly to that topic of sponsorship in the business, because we in 13-14, when Reebok gets involved with the UFC, the whole sponsorship landscape imploded. I mean, we went from a situation where us as Rev Gear were spending 6-figure, maybe even higher sums on athlete sponsorships, and we were considered at that time as a relatively minor player in the sponsorship market, and yet we were spending 6 figures.
Yeah.
And we saw that, and we had fighters. We had everybody from, I'm trying to remember some of the names from back in the day, like Camosi, who was a big deal. We had Dan Hardy, who obviously fought for the welterweight championship for GSP. We had a whole raft of fighters. The Doom, world champion, or later was a world champion. We had a lot of the top Brazilian guys from Rafael Cordeiro's place, all wearing the shorts and the t-shirts and all that stuff. And you had the famous UFC tax, where you had to pay the UFC, I think it was either $50,000 or $100,000, I can't remember, just for the privilege of giving somebody a load of gear and a load of money.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And then in 13-14, when that changes, it all changes. It goes. Yeah. And from fighters being used to, like, everybody thinking, oh, I'm in the UFC now, I should get sponsorship. It took a while, but it imploded. Essentially, from fighters being able to demand a monthly sum of money and this and that, they got to a stage where they'd be lucky to get a free pair of shorts.
Do you think that
it took a long time?
Also gave rise to other associations, ONE FC, and because there was more.
Not for a long time. I mean, eventually did, but at the same time, the amount that we're getting paid to actually fight, and like there was a lot of dissatisfaction with UFC fighters at the time. Guys, like I remember I worked with Jacko and Tenacity.
Yeah.
The guys in Iceland took over Jacko / Tenacity. They had to change the name to Tenacity, but it was effectively the old Jacko brand. And there's a big brand that has basically totally disappeared. But I remember speaking with Gunnar, like when I was training at Mjolnir, and met all the guys, and he had a pretty handsome income from sponsorship money per annum. I won't say what it is on this video, but it was decent, and it literally dropped to zero overnight because he wasn't a high enough fighter in the UFC at that time for Reebok to really give him a big share of the deal. Yeah? And there was a lot of fighters in that position who were just breaking through and just making some income from sponsorships, and then it all, basically the rug was taken from beneath them. But sponsorship from top to bottom, like we're talking about the high level, but it's just across our business. Like every guy who gets on a mat or gets in the cage somehow in his head believes that he is worthy of a deal, right? So what's been your experiences with sponsorships and ROI and how you've got engaged with the community?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, we've been focused especially on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So that's like you said, a niche in a niche in a niche where there's even less money to be made for fighters. Yeah, I mean, there's, and they might be, but there's just so many upcoming white belts and blue belts that won a few tournaments with, and which is great. I mean, they're very talented, hardworking guys and girls. But there's also a group of people that immediately think that other people need to give the money for that, and they're going to be the next world champ.
Because the guys in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I found this really surprising. So in 2017-18, when Rev Gear launched its true Jiu-Jitsu range, like we've been doing Jiu-Jitsu for a long, long time at a basic level for academy sales, but we really launched Jiu-Jitsu 17-18. And we were shocked. We were shocked about how much money was changing hands with the top guys in Jiu-Jitsu.
Oh, yeah.
As a comparative to MMA. Because it was much higher. Like nobody in MMA was getting, and it was as a direct relation to what had happened with the UFC, but it felt like the pendulum had swung. I mean,
that's very interesting, actually.
Do you have that experience, or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you compare to top MMA guys, it's obviously lower. But then the money comes more from the fights themselves than from the sponsor. Well, I mean, not talking about Conor McGregor type of money, but I guess you're right. I'm not really sure why that is.
Because in a lot of ways, like I guess the opportunity was lessened so severely by the UFC just having one brand across all their athletes. Like I believe the model was baseball or American football at the time. You know, they would have one brand that was across the kit, which makes a lot of sense in professional sports. You see it in football in Europe, you see it in rugby, you see it in the other sports too. But it's different in the sense that there are so many different teams, which would have been another way to have sent that direction for MMA. But you have one organization, which was the UFC, which had a stranglehold on the business to a large degree, and they run Fight Pass, so they've got a lot of stuff running through Fight Pass too, which isn't necessarily even MMA. You've got Lion Fight who've gone to Fight Pass, Gloria on Fight Pass. There's lots of other combat sports. Lots of other combat sports on there. But Jiu-Jitsu has gone a different direction, hasn't it? It's got other organizations involved. Maybe that's got something to do with it. Like Flow Grappling's pretty big in Jiu-Jitsu. Brand that we work with, Fight to Win, have become very big in Jiu-Jitsu over the last few years. And there's professional Jiu-Jitsu's moved in. I mean, how much experience have you had with sponsorship with those guys?
Not very much. So we've sponsored tournaments. Mainly smaller ones, but also IBJJF Europeans, for example, things like that, and fighters directly. So that's mainly what we've been doing in terms of sponsorships.
So the state of the industry, so moving really bang up to date, we've talked about being a niche within a niche within a niche, and then we've seen a lot of things come and go. We just talked about the UFC, we talked about how Jiu-Jitsu's grown up as its own sport very much. It has broken away from the main combat sports, I think. It's become its own thing. But obviously what's happened since last year with COVID has really had an impact on the industry as a whole. Like, I mean, and this was a curveball in a way that, you know, nobody could have ever predicted that. I mean, how are you seeing the state of the industry at this moment?
Yeah, everything is dependent on COVID right now.
Is anyone training jiu-jitsu in Europe right now?
Yeah, I mean, Spain has, I'm not sure about all of Spain, but definitely I heard Barcelona and the region around that, but I think it's the whole nation. The academies are open now since last Monday. And there's other countries where people are training. I think there's like Poland and some countries that never stopped having their gyms open officially. And of course, there's a bit of a differentiation between some countries where officially you can't train, but gyms still do it and there's little consequences, and others where it's really strict and they have to close. And then there's obviously
Britain's a shutdown. Britain is a shutdown.
Yeah. Same here in the Netherlands. And then there's a load of people that train at home still underground or in the closed gym with
but like in terms of impact on the industry, like, I mean, what we have seen between Fight Store Pro and Rev Gear Europe, and obviously you've got BJJ Fight Gear and Fuji Europe, but you're focused purely on jiu-jitsu, or have been up until very, very, very recently. And we've got across the four sports. What we saw in jiu-jitsu was a collapse. We just saw an out-and-out collapse of the industry. And in boxing, we would have seen the usual seasonal changes because you have the boxing season start for the ABA guys. So you would see a lot of sales of boxing boots, new gloves, new head guards, all that stuff. None of that happened. Jiu-jitsu, we haven't sold any serious quantity of kimonos in a year. You know, we've seen that. But we've seen sales of grappling dummies, for example, go through the roof in a way that we'd never seen in 10 years. I mean, what's been your experience with your two companies?
Yeah, we've seen the same, a huge collapse. Pretty much as soon as they announced the lockdown, not even when the lockdown was in effect.
Yeah.
Sales just came crashing down. I think we lost 80% of our revenue overnight. It recovered a bit, obviously, when the worst was over from the first wave, and then it came down again with the second. We were not so much into kettlebells and workout equipment, stuff that people could use at home. So we didn't have a sort of alternative that did have a lift off. But yeah, it's been, from a business point of view, it's been terrible.
That's an interesting thing to say, because that's the thing that we would probably both say to anybody coming into business, that be prepared to pivot on a sixpence.
For sure.
You know, because unfortunately, everybody went home workout equipment the first lockdown. But one of the things we saw was by the time we've come to the last one, everybody had already switched to that model. So it changed the competition level. So it spread out the availability of that revenue. And when we're talking, we've both said we're a niche within a niche, and perhaps BJJ is even more of a niche by itself.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you think it's going to affect the industry going forward? Rather than, like, we know what we know up to now. Like, when the gyms open, do you think it's all just going to click back in, or do you think there'll be a lot of uncertainty? There's obviously uncertainty about whether you're going to be able to trade next week, next month as a gym. But from our point of view in the e-commerce business, so to speak, how do you think it's going to affect your thinking?
I think it's going to be pretty resilient, presuming that the gyms can stay open for a bit longer and it doesn't go right back into lockdown again. I think a lot of young people are training. They're not really that worried about getting the virus themselves.
Yeah.
So they just, I mean, as soon as they are allowed to, they want to train and they need gear for that. So I think that they can bounce back pretty quickly, but there's obviously a part of the people that used to train that just stopped and got different interests because it took so long, or they're still afraid, and it will take a bit longer, I guess, for new people to jump in. But at the same time, I also hear so many stories of gyms that even during COVID times, but they were still allowed to open, that like just record numbers of new enrollments every week.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things that I've heard from a lot of the gyms, because we deal directly with gyms a lot, we've got like 100 and odd active gym customers at the moment with RevGear in particular. We hear a lot of like they're seeing their memberships just dwindle, and a lot of them are concerned that by the time they can reopen, how it's not a case of they won't get their memberships back up to the original levels. It's how long will it take to get it there.
Yeah.
Not so much, and I wonder whether that's going to have a direct impact on us. But with every upheaval like this, it often has it will also have the effect of shaking up the barrel and getting rid of some people, and there'll be some new people come into the market. We'll probably see that with some of the brands as well.
Yeah.
Some of like the brands or the businesses which are probably in the middle bracket, not so much the bottom, not so much the top, but in the middle bracket where they weren't that strong in the first place, but maybe had bigger overheads than they should have, and so on and so forth. I wonder whether we'll see a lot of exits there.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think there'll be a diversification the way people do business going forward?
Well, that's an interesting question. If you look at like emerging economies, countries like India, Brazil, there's often these big diversified groups. So like look at a Tata, they have steel, I think they have consultancy services, there are all kinds of stuff, which from a developed market perspective doesn't make sense. Most companies are just specialized in something.
Yeah.
It just creates a lot of overhead and difficulties. But in a country where there's a lot of risk involved with your economy, where it's not so stable, it makes sense to diversify. Those companies can help each other. You have a finance company involved, blah, blah, blah. So I think maybe this whole thing shakes people up a little bit and say, hey, maybe you need to diversify, and maybe you need to keep
get rid of the complacency in your thinking.
Yeah. Like you just have to anticipate a little bit more risk next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So it's definitely changed my mindset. We've been hyper-focused on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and we're going to still do that, and we're going to be fully prepared once the market comes back and take full opportunity of that. But in the meantime, we're also going to diversify and go into other niches, other product categories. And when Jiu-Jitsu bounces back, we have that and the stuff that we have developed in the meantime.
And if we would talk, a lot of people who watch this podcast, there'll be a lot of people from the business as a whole who'll be interested in what we've had to say on this. But I imagine there'll be a lot of people, just business people generally, who might watch this and go, that's an interesting marketplace to hear their experience. Now, as Fight Store Pro, it was interesting because, we mentioned the home fitness stuff. Now, we'd already made that decision at the turn of the year when we changed over to the Shopify platform. And that's something I've seen a lot of over the years, where you change platforms because one platform was the hot platform that was the best place to be, and then it changes. And we'd already made that decision, and we found ourselves some suppliers for the more gym equipment based marketplace with a little bit of a thought towards home gyms. And I'd already started that blog about Man Cave blog and all that stuff. And I was seeing a lot of guys in their 30s and 40s beginning to build home gyms. This was before COVID. This was long before COVID. And the decision process that I made at the time was, well, guys who are coming into the store are spending upwards of 500 to $1,000 or more on their equipment. But if we sold the plate weights and all the other stuff, then they might spend $3,000 with us, as opposed to our average sale that you mentioned before of like £100 kind of level. Yeah. So we went into that market because of that. We didn't go into it for any other reason. But now we've seen what happened with COVID. We're like, hell, we should have been there from day one. We were of that opinion. But with anybody watching this who's in another business where they've been hit very, very hard, perhaps, and they're thinking about diversification and so on, like, I wonder about how prepared you had to be for this. You can't prepare for the complete unknown, but you can have the mindset which does make that switch. I mean, have you got any experiences from the last year that you've gone, hell, I could have actually seen this and gone, yeah, we're maybe too much in one niche?
Yeah. I didn't expect a pandemic to come up. I mean, it was always a possibility.
No one did.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're going to be in food, in housing, those are basic needs that people always need. So, those stuff happens. A leisure activity such as combat sports is a bit vulnerable. I think, I'm not sure whether I would have done something different in that sense in terms of the focus on the industry, but I think what I would have done a bit different, we were a bit over leveraged and focused on revenue growth, long-term vision on that, which put us in a little bit of a tricky situation as soon as the revenue dropped and bills kept piling up. So I think looking backwards, maybe I would have taken a bit more of a short-term, profit-oriented approach.
Build up strength.
Yeah. That will definitely get you through this kind of situation easier. In the first few months, we had to focus on financial issues, and we didn't have the energy or focus to try to pivot into other industries. And if we have had that, then we would have maybe been able to capitalize on opportunities much faster.
So we're coming to the end of this one today, and I think we're both reasonably successful business owners. We both set up businesses from scratch, and we've both been in for about a decade or so. Yeah. If you were going to give some straight up advice to somebody coming into an industry, maybe not the same as ours, but not dissimilar, yeah, whether it be a product-based business, perhaps in a niche that they're interested in. I mean, what would we say would be our top 5 tips? You can have the first one.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to hear yours too. I mentioned somewhere in the beginning of this call already. I think it's good to seek out advice. You should definitely just start and learn from experience and try to figure things out. But it just helps to listen to other people, even though you might think that you know everything better yourself. And sometimes you hear advice from people and you think, that's not going to happen to me. It actually happened to 2 of us.
Find a mentor.
Yeah, find a mentor.
When we say a mentor, we've got to be careful, haven't we? Because one of the things that I've seen people make a real huge mistake on, in a similar vein to this, is where they take on board advice from people, but those people aren't really qualified to be giving that advice. Like they don't have the background to really speak sensibly. But if you've got the people who actually have a handle on it, I mean, they've been there, done it, can't go wrong with that advice.
Totally. You should definitely check what do people do, not just what they say. If someone doesn't have any money, then he shouldn't give you financial advice, right?
Well, unless they had a load and lost it. Wow.
Yeah, that's true. But you have to look at that too. But it's very important to check, like, what does somebody actually do? Or
I made a huge mistake with Fight Store within its first 3 years, where we actually had a solid offer for the company, and I would have walked away with 6 figures. I mean, it wasn't the thick end of 6 figures, but it was 6 figures. Yeah. And looking back on that experience, I could have gone, if I'd really had a clear idea of how I would have turned the next 6 figures into the next 3 businesses, things could have been very, very different. But I was focused on the idea that I can go to the moon on it at the time. And I think that was a bad call. I think I should have probably taken the money and run. I've been successful and then redeveloped a new idea, taken some time out. One of the bits of advice I always like to give about setting up a business is work backwards from where you want to be. So imagine your life, like you said this at the start of this podcast, you said you had these ideas about passive income and how it would all work, and you could sit back and watch the money roll in, which never quite works like that. but which we both found out pretty quick. But when you get a serious idea about how every day looks for you, and then work out how it actually functions from there and what you're going to have to do to get there, I think and a part two of that advice, which is in the same vein, would be to consider when you're putting in too much energy for the output. I think there's a tipping point, and we've probably both hit it because we've both been in for a long time, where you're getting that, what's the phrase? Law of diminishing returns.
Yep.
Where you're putting a lot of energy in still, but you're not getting the return in line, and perhaps that's time to maneuver to a new project, but let the old one continue to run.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, how about your advice towards, if you were going to come into the fight sports industry from today, where would you point somebody to go? Where would you say, hey, there's still an opening over there?
Well, I don't want to point them into anything that we are trying to do. But
I'd probably say turn tails, run and scream, but
I think there's definitely a lot of brands. So on that end, maybe there's not so much opportunity. At the same time, there's a lot of brands that are just messing about a little bit. If you come in with a good idea, you can set yourself apart, and you can consistently push your
like a
message.
Great one was BJJ Fanatics. Like, I mean, that model was an amazing model. Like, where they went out and they partnered with hundreds of, like, loads of different guys producing great content to learn from. And I thought that was a great business idea.
Definitely.
In the sport. Yeah, I thought that was different. It was, and I've got a lot of, I thought that as a business model was brilliant. I also think the guys who are actually doing a professional job of the home learning via Zoom or whatever, not there's just stuff to keep students, but the actual put the content out there in a structured way. I think there's still some, I think there's some way to go in that.
Yeah, definitely. Those are some really good examples.
Yeah. Have you got any product thoughts?
I mean, like 80% of this of our sales is the more basic products. Beginners,
the small
stuff. No gi. Yeah. So that's a good question, but I do think that the industry is maybe, well, it's sort of in between, whether it depends on the product, whether it's big enough for a good idea to really make it worth your while and effort to develop it and try to market it and push all your time and money into that.
For sure. So what do you think the future holds for BJJ Fight Gear and Fuji?
I think the future looks good, especially when the pandemic fades away. I think people are going to be just hungry for getting into contact with other people, doing fun stuff, doing sports. So I think there's a very big opportunity for our industry in general, and BJJ Fight Gear Fuji. We have a very good relationship. We're in this for the long run, and I see also a lot of opportunity for Fuji in Europe. BJJ Fight Gear, we're obviously a multi-brand store. That is going to be a challenge in the years going forward. On one hand, Amazon just keeps getting bigger, but who knows what happens? Maybe there will be regulations. It will be, and I don't know even how that's possible. It will be split up, and there will be new opportunities for small businesses like us.
One of the things I think is an interesting change to the landscape, which certainly will happen for BJJ, is I feel that there'll be more and more split between the high-end niche brands who produce next to nothing, the show-year-olds of this world being the key example of that. Yeah. And then the other end of the market, where it's the introductory product, which at the end of the day, nobody really, certainly the clubs and the instructors, are less concerned about whether it looks nice in photos. And that middle ground, I think, may start to disappear.
Right.
Because we're seeing it in the boxing gloves market, which like never before. You have the high end where people produce nothing. You know, the grants of this world, the winnings, the grants, where albeit there's a very high-end marketplace, they don't produce enough to even service one gym a year, really, if they were having to service all the clients. But then you've got the other end of the market where it's the bulk, where you're seeing more and more stuff come through from completely unknown people within the market, but it's being produced at a lower and lower cost and profit margin. So I can see that happening across the boards.
Yeah, and that's a bit of a risk for, especially in jiu-jitsu, but it's already happening in boxing and kickboxing where
you get a lot of, as you mentioned before, Amazon with the direct.
And the bigger brand, when the pie becomes big enough, then you get the Carrefours and the bigger brands that have no idea about what jiu-jitsu or kickboxing is.
Like the sand-filled plastic kettlebells in the supermarket.
Yeah.
And on that note, Micha, it's been a good start to the Fight Business podcast. I hope it gets a good return, and we see some new visits to BJJ Fight Gear, and we'll catch up soon.
For sure. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. See you later.
Take care, man.
Bye.